The world does not usually feel like it can be cornered by a strip of water. But right now, that is exactly what this looks like. One narrow channel at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, one place where tankers, gas carriers, and container ships have to pass, and suddenly the global economy is holding its breath. Iran has not needed to sink every ship to change the game. It only needed to turn normal passage into a gamble. And now the United States is moving from warning to pressure, because when the Strait of Hormuz stops feeling open, everything from oil prices to military calculations starts to move at once. This is not just another Middle East headline. This is a stress test for the entire system. If Iran can decide who passes, who waits, who pays, and who risks being hit, then the question is no longer just about one regional crisis. The question becomes whether the world's most important energy artery can be turned into a lever of power. And if that lever stays in Iranian hands for too long, the consequences reach far beyond Tehran, Washington, or the Gulf. They reach into shipping insurance, inflation, supermarket prices, government budgets, military credibility, and the basic rules that keep trade moving. What makes this more serious is that the move appears more controlled than chaotic. This does not look like a simple all-or-nothing closure. It looks more like selective restriction, permission systems, vetting, warnings, quiet passage for some ships, danger for others. That matters because selective control is harder to answer than a dramatic full shutdown. A total closure is loud and obvious. A selective chokehold is more slippery. It lets Iran squeeze the artery without always sealing it shut. It creates fear, confusion, and delay while leaving just enough movement to complicate a direct military response. And this is where the title of this story really starts to mean something. After Iran restricts Hormuz, the United States does not just see a shipping problem. It sees a challenge to American deterrence, a challenge to freedom of navigation, and a challenge to the idea that global trade routes cannot be privatized by force. In simple terms, deterrence means making the other side think the cost of a move will be too high to try. But if Iran has already shown it can choke the waterway even temporarily, then Washington has a credibility problem. Because once a red line gets tested, everyone watches what happens next. If you want clear breakdowns when a headline starts turning into a global crisis, stay with this one, because the next layer is where the real danger comes into focus. To understand why Hormuz matters so much, picture a giant funnel. The wide Persian Gulf narrows into a tight exit. On one side is Iran. On the other side are Oman and the Arabian Peninsula. Through that narrow exit moves a huge share of the world's seaborne oil and liquefied natural gas. In plain language, this is one of the main valves of the global energy system. When that valve is smooth, the world barely notices. When it tightens, markets feel it immediately. Not months later. Immediately. Traders react. Insurance rates jump. Tanker owners hesitate. Governments start making calls. Militaries start calculating range, timing, and escalation risk. But here is the deeper problem. Iran does not need to permanently close the strait to create pressure. It only needs to make safe transit uncertain. That uncertainty does most of the work. If captains need permission, if companies fear being flagged, if crews think they could be targeted, if one side hears radio warnings and another side hears a threat of force, commercial traffic starts to thin out even before missiles fly. That means Tehran can achieve a major effect with a smaller visible action. It can raise costs, divide countries, and test how much pain the world will tolerate before pushing back. That gives Iran something it has not always had in direct military terms against the United States. It gives leverage. Tehran knows it cannot match Washington ship for ship or plane for plane, but it does not have to. It only has to threaten the place where geography does the fighting for it. Narrow waters favor disruption. A handful of mines, anti-ship missiles, drones, fast attack boats, coastal launchers, and intelligence on vessel movements can make a huge military power slow down. Not because the United States is weak, but because even the strongest navy has to think differently in a cramped, crowded, weapon-saturated corridor. For Washington, that is unacceptable for reasons bigger than oil. The United States has spent decades presenting itself as the ultimate guarantor of open sea lanes. That promise sits quietly under a lot of global trade. It is one of those invisible pillars people ignore until it shakes. If the world starts believing that America can protect shipping in theory but not in practice when it matters most, then allies get nervous, rivals get bold, and every other choke point on the map starts looking more dangerous. The message would not stay in Hormuz. It would echo. If this story matters to you, subscribe for real breakdowns instead of surface-level noise. And tell me in the comments whether you think this is mainly about oil or about power. So, what does stepping up pressure actually mean? It means Washington has more than one tool on the table, and none of them are simple. Military pressure is the most visible. More naval presence, more surveillance, more escorts, more warnings, more positioning of air power and strike options. But economic and diplomatic pressure matter too. The United States can tighten sanctions, target networks tied to the Revolutionary Guard, push allies to isolate the restriction system, pressure insurers and shipping firms, and make it harder for any country or company to normalize Iranian control over passage. In other words, the pressure campaign is not only about blowing something up, it is about making the cost of holding that choke point too high to sustain. Still, the military side cannot be ignored, because that is the shadow hanging over all of this. If the United States wants ships to move freely, it may eventually have to prove that those ships can move without asking Iran for permission. And that is where the crisis becomes extremely dangerous. Reopening a narrow waterway under threat sounds straightforward from far away. In reality, it is one of the hardest and riskiest jobs in modern warfare. Mines have to be found and cleared. Missile launchers have to be tracked. Drones have to be intercepted. Fast boats have to be watched. Radar has to see through clutter. Civilian shipping has to be protected while military forces prepare for sudden attacks from shore, sea, or air. This is why the pressure from Washington is rising so fast. Time works differently in a crisis like this. Every day of delay makes Iran's position look more real. Every controlled transit makes the system feel more normal. Every tanker that waits for permission creates a dangerous precedent. And once a precedent hardens, reversing it can require much more force later than it would have required earlier. That is the part most people miss. A temporary restriction can become a political fact if the world starts acting like it is permanent. And even if American warships are closer, the strait does not become simple. It becomes more crowded, more electric, and more prone to one mistake that nobody can take back. A warning shot, a drone interception, a radar lock, a damaged tanker, a crew killed on a commercial ship. In open ocean, forces have space. In Hormuz, space disappears. The margin for error shrinks. That is why pressure and restraint start traveling together. Washington wants to show strength without tumbling into a larger regional war. Tehran wants leverage without inviting overwhelming retaliation. That balancing act is where the next phase will be decided. Stay with me, because the economic side of this is where the pressure becomes visible in everyday life. When people hear about the Strait of Hormuz, they often think only about oil prices. But the real impact is wider and faster than that. Energy is not just what goes into a car. It shapes electricity costs, transport costs, factory costs, fertilizer costs, shipping costs, and eventually food costs. If enough energy gets delayed, priced higher, or trapped behind a risky route, the effect spreads through the system like a shockwave. It reaches the gas pump, yes, but it also reaches the grocery store, the pharmacy, and the household budget. That is why leaders far from the Gulf pay attention the moment Hormuz starts looking unstable. Asian economies feel this especially hard because many of them rely heavily on energy flows coming through that passage. That means the shock is not evenly shared. Some countries can absorb it better. Some cannot. Some Gulf producers have pipelines and ports that let them bypass part of the problem. Others remain heavily exposed. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have some alternative routes that reduce their vulnerability, even if not completely. Iraq, Kuwait, and Qatar are in a far tighter bind. Geography decides who can reroute and who gets trapped. In a crisis like this, maps become destiny. That creates a strange and brutal split inside the region itself. Some states suffer deeply because exports get stuck. Others get partial relief because high prices offset lower shipment volumes. And Iran, despite sanctions and military pressure, may still gain leverage simply because it sits next to the switch. Even a battered state can become dangerous when geography hands it a pressure point. That is why this story is not really about who looks stronger in a headline. It is about who can impose costs in the place where the world is least able to ignore them. Now add China to the picture and the crisis widens again. If Iranian-linked oil continues to find ways to move east while other traffic slows, Tehran is not only disrupting trade, it is shaping trade. If toll-like payments, selective permissions, or favored routes start appearing, then this is no longer just a wartime emergency. It starts looking like an attempt to build a new pattern of access under coercion. That would be a direct challenge not only to American pressure, but also to the legal and economic norms that global shipping relies on. If you want more than headlines and want the actual mechanics behind these crises, hit subscribe. Satsi endamser engir ein anun. The next part changes how this whole story should be seen. Because the real issue is bigger than whether Iran can hold Hormuz forever. It probably does not need to. It only needs to prove that it can hold it long enough to extract political value. That value comes in many forms: higher costs for rivals, pressure on U.S. partners, panic in markets, diplomatic attention, leverage in negotiations, domestic propaganda at home, and perhaps most important, the message that Iran remains capable of shaping the battlefield even after taking damage elsewhere. That last point matters. In a straight conventional comparison, the United States looks vastly stronger. Its navy, air power, surveillance, and strike capacity are on another level. But wars are rarely decided by raw comparison charts. They are decided by where the fight happens, what political limits exist, how much risk each side is willing to absorb, and whether the weaker side can weaponize time and geography. Iran understands that. Hormuz is not just a passage. It is a tool for turning weakness into leverage. So, when Washington steps up pressure, it is not only punishing a restriction, it is trying to stop a model from taking root. If Iran can turn a global choke point into a gatekeeping system, then others will study that lesson. Rival powers, regional militias, even non-state actors will see that the fastest way to disturb the international order is not necessarily to win a large war. It is to seize a narrow point where commerce has to pass and then dare the world to force it open. That is the strategic nightmare behind this moment. This is also why legal language and naval movement now overlap. Rules matter because rules shape legitimacy. If Iran says it is acting for security, but the rest of the world sees a toll booth with missiles behind it, the dispute becomes about whether international waterways can be conditioned by force. The United States wants that answer to be no. Fast, clearly, and publicly. Because once companies, crews, and even governments start adapting to a coerced system, the rule is weakened whether lawyers approve or not. Let me know what you think this signals. Is Tehran trying to gain bargaining power, or is it testing how far it can rewrite the rules in real time? And this is where the risk of escalation becomes brutally real. Imagine an escorted commercial convoy moving through the strait. U.S. warships nearby, Iranian patrol craft close to shore, drones overhead, coastal missile batteries alert, civilian crews under stress, radar screens crowded. Then one vessel turns unexpectedly. One warning is misunderstood. One electronic signal is misread. A missile launches, maybe by design, maybe by panic. In a tight waterway, seconds matter. There is no calm pause after that. There is impact, smoke, fire, casualties, and then the pressure on presidents and commanders to answer immediately. That is why even the threat of reopening by force carries its own danger. The United States may be able to destroy Iranian launchers, boats, and facilities in large numbers if it chooses. But that does not mean the first hours would be clean. Iran has enough tools to make the opening phase painful. It can scatter assets, use mobility, rely on hardened positions, and force the United States to defend commercial shipping while also hunting threats. It can also use proxies or partner groups elsewhere in the region to stretch the crisis beyond the strait itself. A clash in Hormuz does not have to stay in Hormuz. And if the conflict spills outward, the map becomes much uglier. Saudi energy infrastructure, Emirati ports, Iraqi terminals, Red Sea routes, and American bases across the region all become part of the wider calculation. The crisis can jump from one narrow waterway to a network of targets. That is what makes this more than a shipping standoff. It is a gateway to regional escalation, and everybody involved knows it. That is why words from Washington may sound harsh even when action remains measured. The United States wants Iran to back down before proving, in combat, how far this can spread. At the same time, domestic politics sharpen every move. In Washington, no administration wants to look weak in the face of a challenge to global shipping. In Tehran, no leadership wants to look like it folded under threats. In Gulf capitals, rulers want protection without becoming battlefields. In Europe and Asia, governments want energy stability without being dragged into a war. Each player wants a different outcome, but it texting down but the strait binds them together. That is why diplomacy here is not soft. It is part of the battlefield. If you are still here, stay to the end, because the next question is the one that decides whether this becomes a crisis or a turning point. So, what happens next? There are a few broad paths, and all of them carry danger. One path is controlled de-escalation. Iran loosens restrictions gradually, selected traffic resumes, Washington claims pressure worked, markets calm, and both sides avoid the worst. This is the cleanest option, but it is also the most fragile because it leaves the memory of the restriction intact. Everyone would know the switch can be pulled again. Even if trade restarts, trust does not come back on the same timetable. A second path is prolonged gray zone control. That means no full war, but no real normality either. Passage continues only for approved vessels or through informal arrangements. Insurance stays expensive. Shipping remains cautious. The United States increases sanctions, intelligence pressure, naval presence, and coalition activity, but avoids a large strike. Iran keeps just enough pressure to maintain leverage without crossing the threshold that guarantees a major military response. This kind of half-war can last longer than people expect because it spreads pain without delivering a clean breaking point. The third path is the one everyone fears. One incident becomes a trigger. An attack on a tanker, a U.S. escort vessel, an offshore platform, or a port facility changes the political math in a single hour. Washington responds with force. Iran retaliates. Regional actors get pulled in. Energy infrastructure becomes a target set. Markets do not just rise, they lurch. Insurance does not just become expensive. Some coverage disappears. Shipping companies do not just hesitate, they stop. At that point, the crisis is no longer about whether passage is restricted. It becomes about how much of the regional order survives the response. And here is the part most people underestimate. Even if the United States wins every major exchange in military terms, the world could still come out of the crisis more unstable. Why? Because the lesson would be that a determined regional power can still trigger global economic pain before being subdued. That is enough to inspire copycats, force higher defense spending, and make every major sea lane look more vulnerable. Victory after disruption is not the same as preventing disruption in the first place. Follow this story closely because it is moving faster than many governments want to admit. And if you want sharp explainers like this as events unfold, subscribe now. There is another angle here that deserves more attention. This crisis exposes how much modern life depends on narrow passages that most people could not find on a map a week ago. Hormuz is one of them. The Red Sea is another. The Bab el-Mandeb is another. These are not just points on a chart. They are compression points for global trade. When conflict reaches them, it magnifies. A local fight becomes a worldwide cost because the flow of energy and goods is concentrated. That concentration is efficient in peacetime and dangerous in crisis. In other words, the system looks powerful until it meets geography under pressure. Then it suddenly looks fragile. And that fragility creates incentives for states like Iran. If you cannot outmatch a superpower globally, you look for the narrow place where the superpower's advantages become harder to use. That does not erase American strength. It complicates it. It forces Washington to respond carefully, visibly, and often at high cost, just to restore what used to exist by default. That is also why this moment matters beyond the immediate confrontation. If the United States allows a selective control regime to settle in, even briefly, it weakens the principle that vital sea lanes stay open to lawful passage. If it responds too hard and the region explodes, it proves that the system can only be defended through repeated brinkmanship. Both outcomes are dangerous. The challenge is to reestablish freedom of movement without creating a larger fire. That sounds like a policy sentence. In practice, it means balancing naval force, sanctions, coalition management, and timing under intense pressure. And while all of that is happening at the strategic level, remember the human level. Commercial crews are still the ones who sail into the corridor. Young sailors on destroyers are still the ones watching the radar at night. Families in energy-importing countries are still the ones who pay more when transport costs rise. Dumming sitsenjur yourself. Traders stare at screens. Captains listen to warnings over the radio. Commanders wait for orders. Presidents weigh prestige against risk. The whole chain from a dark bridge on a tanker to a crowded kitchen table at home is connected by this one narrow passage. And if you have made it this far, drop your view below. Do you think this pressure ends in negotiation, or do you think someone eventually miscalculates? Because in the end, this is not just a story about Iran tightening control and the United States pushing back. It is a story about what happens when geography gives a regional power the ability to challenge the wider order. It is a story about whether the rules of global trade are real rules or just habits that hold until somebody armed and determined decides to test them. And right now, those habits are being tested in one of the most sensitive places on Earth. Iran appears to understand that it does not need total victory. It only needs to show that it can disrupt the flow, divide the response, and survive long enough to change the calculation. The United States understands that it does not need to occupy the strait forever, but it does need to prove that coercion cannot become the new normal. Those are two very different goals, and they collide in the same water. That is why this moment feels bigger than a single headline. Because if Hormuz can be restricted today, then every choke point tomorrow becomes a question mark. Every tanker route becomes a strategic vulnerability. Every promise of stability starts sounding more conditional. And every rival watching from a distance starts learning. The ships that pass through that narrow channel are carrying more than oil and gas. They are carrying credibility, rules, pressure, fear, and the possibility of escalation. That is what makes this so dangerous. Not just what has happened, but what it reveals. The world is seeing in real time how thin the line can be between open trade and controlled access, between deterrence and doubt, between pressure and war. And that is the warning hanging over this crisis now. If the strait becomes a toll gate backed by force, the damage will not stop at the water's edge. It will spread through markets, alliances, military planning, and the way the world thinks about power itself. The next move will matter. The response will matter. But the biggest fact may already be in front of us. Once a choke point is weaponized and the world feels the shock, nothing about that route ever looks ordinary again.